Hello there. Welcome to the presentation titled Prioritizing Positioning, an Exploration of the Influence of Teacher and Learner Positioning in the Writing Classroom. I am Dr. Nazarana Mather from the IIE's Varsity College online campus in South Africa. The following will be covered in this presentation and is laid out as follows. An introduction to the study will be provided, followed by a review of the key literature that informed the study, and finally the findings, discussion, and conclusion. In this section of the presentation, the background, aims, and purpose, sample, data collection, and analysis will be explained. Existing research shows that in South Africa, there are reasons for concern regarding the achievements of a large portion of grade 6 learners in language learning. The impact of this poor language achievement affects their success rates across learning areas and in higher grades. It has been found that historically, grade 6 boys have achieved and continue to achieve lower results than their female peers in national and international language assessments. However, boys' language learning, especially in primary schools, is surprisingly under-researched, particularly their writing skills development. This study contributes to the existing field of research by using positioning theory to understand grade 6 boys' writing development. For this interpretive, qualitative, theory-seeking case study, data were gathered from classroom observations and the data were analyzed from the perspective of positioning theory. 2 schools participated in the study. A cycle of the grade 6 writing program in each school was analyzed. In the review of literature section, I will now unpack research pertaining to boys' writing, writing research, and positioning theory. It has been found that a gender gap that favors girls academically exists both nationally and internationally. International research into this situation has indicated that girls outperform boys in all subjects. In South Africa, the following is based on the 2016 PEARLS assessment results. The South African gender gap in reading is the second highest in the world. Girls scored much higher than boys in reading across the board. In grade 4, girls are a full year in learning ahead of boys. 84% of South African boys did not reach the low benchmark category. The gap between boys and girls is also growing over time and was larger than it was in 2011. In primary schools, reading rather than writing has been the dominant research focus. However, writing is also a skill that is central to all learning. One South African study on teaching writing at primary school level found that learners do not write at the required level, so teachers are concerned about the written language development of their learners, as writing is integral to all learning. At the time of conducting the study, writing research about middle school learners in South Africa remained relatively uncharted. Research that has been conducted stressed the importance of writing, teaching writing, and researching writing, and has foregrounded the need for interventions in the writing classroom, particularly in terms of teacher development. Positioning theory was originally developed by social psychologist Harry to try to understand the dynamic, emergent nature of social interaction. He used the term position rather than role, as role was more fixed and stable. Position could capture the fluid and changing nature of how people interact in a social situation. Positioning theory is the study of the nature, formation, influence, and ways of change of local systems of rights and duties, as shared assumptions of them influence small-scale interactions. It views positioning as a dynamic form of social role and aims to explain the relationship between discourse and psychological phenomena. Positioning theory offers a conceptual system within which the unfolding episodes of everyday life can be followed in fresh and enlightening ways because it concerns conventions of speech that are easily altered, can be contested, and last for a short time. More recently, scholars have begun to apply Herman's ideas to education. Rule drew on both Hare and Hermans in using the notion of position along with dialogue and cognition in his framework of diacognition for understanding, teaching, and learning as knowing. Grossman states that the process approach to writing focuses on the process that the learners and teachers go through when writing. Each stage has a purpose with outcomes that the learners need to achieve. The writing process includes generating ideas, deciding which ideas are relevant to the message, and then using the language available to communicate that message in a process that evolves and develops. Therefore, the teacher shifts from the position of being only a linguistic judge to that of a reader responding to what the learners have written, and the learners shift between the positions of thinker, planner, writer, reader, and so on. The findings, discussion, and conclusions for this study will now be provided. After analyzing 4 episodes from the lesson observations, it was found that using positioning theory as a lens illuminated several aspects of teaching and learning during the cycle of the writing process in a grade 6 classroom. The relations between dialogue, position, and cognition were quite different in the 2 classrooms. In School A, Mrs. Chetty instigated dialogue that positioned learners as co-creators and writers, whereas in School B, Mrs. Naidu instigated dialogue that placed her learners in multiple positions, sometimes confusing and often unrelated to the task. This links to the relations between position and cognition. Mrs. Chetty took up positions and positioned learners in a way that led them to cognition. Mrs. Naidu, however, did not, which resulted in unanticipated cognitions. In School A, she positioned herself as leader of the whole class discussion, facilitator during the planning process, editor, and assessor, and correspondingly so did the learners, co-creators of an imaginative story, planners and critical thinkers, writers and editors, throughout the writing cycle to scaffold their writing skills. While in School B, the teacher foregrounded the stages of a writing cycle, instead of using the writing cycle to position herself and her learners to scaffold their writing skills. This indicates that the teacher needs to know the object of cognition and have a clear idea of what the object of cognition is to guide learners effectively in cognizing this object. Subject matter knowledge must also be sound so that the learners can recognize the object of cognition to enable their learners to know it. Adding to this knowledge, the teacher needs to choose the most appropriate teaching technique to instigate learning and enable the learners to know the object of cognition. Appropriate techniques must be selected by using her knowledge of her learners. There must be a fit between the learners, the teaching technique, the level of language, and the positioning. Now, if one compares the act of teacher positioning in School A to those in School B, one can see how positioning has enabled achievement and has not enabled the achievement of pedagogical goals, respectively. In School A, Mrs. Chetty's dominant positions were appropriate to helping her learners. In School B, Mrs. Naidu did not always choose positions that were linked to the object of cognition, so her frequent positional transitions of both herself and the learners tended to disrupt and confuse them. So while considering their identities as teacher and language learners in the context they situate themselves in, particularly to the public discourse that boys are known as poor achievers in literacy, the following was noted. Mrs. Chetty seemed to read the context of the boys well by recognizing their need for stimulation that focused on action, movement, excitement, and by drawing on what they already knew. Mrs. Naidu did not really engage with the boys' context and needs. Mainly, she treated them as passive recipients of knowledge, but she misjudged what they knew. Although she did try to link to their prior knowledge of stories, this backfired when they reproduced the stories rather than developed their own imaginative writing. The findings from an analysis of 4 episodes from 2 grade 6 writing lessons using positioning theory were presented. In the first episode, the teacher successfully positioned her learners and engaged them in a discussion which supported them to plan their own version of a story. In episode 2 in School B, the teacher's lack of knowledge resulted in her inability to correctly position herself and her learners, so they did not meet her expectations. The results of which can be seen in episode 3. Also evident from episode 3 was the use of positioning to reach shared understanding, which contributed to the teacher's knowledge of her learners and helped her respond appropriately when a similar incident occurred later in the lesson. Finally, episode 4 highlighted the need for acceptance of positions during the stages of the writing cycle as, in this episode, the boy rejected the positioning, which resulted in his work not being peer edited, which then leads to an increase in the teacher's workload as she now had to edit his work. It can be concluded that positioning plays a key role during the stages of the writing process, and that if the teacher and learners fail to position each other and themselves correctly, the quality of the learner's engagement during each stage and the completion of tasks could be compromised. The importance of teacher knowledge was foregrounded, because if the teacher is limited in any area of knowledge, she will be unable to position herself and her learners adequately, which will then hinder the learner's learning progress. These were the sources that were consulted for this research. I thank you for attending the presentation.